I welcome you again for our continued lecture on human rights in British rule. Today, we will focus on one of the most important and one of the most devastating aspects of colonial rule in India, that is, economic exploitation. While political domination and cultural control were significant, it was the systematic destruction of India's economy that had the most long lasting effects. The British East India Company and later the British Crown used India not for development but for extraction and profit. Our agenda today is as follows. First, we will recall the prosperity of India before British rule, when the country was a leading manufacturing hub and trading nation. Then we will examine the different phases of colonial economic policy and how each one deepened exploitation. We will move on to the land revenue system, Zamindari, Rayatwari, and Mahalwari, which destroyed traditional agrarian rights. We will then discuss the destruction of India's industries, especially textiles, and how artisans were reduced to poverty. Next, we will explore Dadabhai Naoroji's drain theory, which explain how wealth was systematically transferred to Britain. We will also look at the impact of colonial policies on agriculture, famine, and food security. Finally, we will connect economic exploitation with the rise of Indian nationalism, showing how the freedom struggle was closely linked to economic grievance. By the end of this lecture, you will see clearly that British rule was built on the ruthless economic exploitation of India, leaving behind poverty, famine, and inequality that shaped our nation's history. When we speak of economic exploitation under colonialism, we are describing the systematic process by which the wealth of India was drained to enrich Britain. As the text in our sources notes, India was a victim of loot and plunder by the British for more than 200 years. While India was totally drained, Britain flourished on this economic loot. Britain's industrial revolution was built on the destruction of India's thriving manufacturing industries. Unquote. This statement captures the essence of economic exploitation. The British did not come to India to develop it. They came first as traders, then as rulers, and finally as extractors of wealth. They converted India into Britain's cash cow, using Indian revenues, taxes, and resources to strengthen their empires abroad. As the French ambassador to London observed at the time, quote, there are few things in Europe richer than the directors of the English East India Company, unquote. Under British rule, the once prosperous Indian economy was transformed into a stagnant colonial economy. From being a world leader in textiles, shipbuilding, and commerce, India was reduced to supplier of raw materials and a consumer of British goods. Every major economic policy, from land revenue systems to trade restrictions, was designed to benefit Britain. So, when we study economic exploitation, we are really studying how a wealthy and productive nation was deliberately impoverished. This exploitation was not accidental, it was systematic, planned, and central to the British colonial policy. To understand the depth of economic exploitation, we must first appreciate the prosperity of India before British domination. According to the text, at the beginning of the 18th century, India's share of the world economy was 23%, equal to all of Europe put together. It was around 27% in 1700 when the Mughal Empire, Aurangzeb's treasury, raked in 500 million in tax revenue alone. Unquote. This shows the strength of India's economy before colonial interference. India was famous across the world for its textiles. Bengal's muslin, Gujarat's cotton, and Varanasi's silk were exported to Egypt, Turkey, Persia, Java, China, Japan, and Europe. The file notes that Bengal's textile export alone in the 1750s were valued at 16 million rupees annually, with silk exports worth another 6.5 million rupees. Clearly, India was not a backward country but a highly industrial and commercial power. Apart from textiles, India excelled in shipbuilding, metallurgy, jewelry, ceramics, and architecture. According to J.T. Sunderland, described India as, to quote, a far greater industrial and manufacturing nation than any in Europe or any other nation, unquote. He pointed out that nearly every product valued for beauty or utility was produced in India. This prosperity is crucial to remember because it reveals the magnitude of what was lost under colonial rule. India was not developed by the British. Rather, it was systematically deindustrialized and impoverished to serve Britain's economic interest. The economic exploitation of India under British rule can be studied in three phases. The first phase, from the late 18th century to 1813, was one of outright plunder and annexation. The East India Company imposed monopolies, seized territories, and extracted wealth without restraint. This period was about conquering markets and resources. The second phase, from 1813 to 1857, witnessed the gradual opening of India to British manufacturers. As the file notes, the company began to reconcile its interests with those of the English government. Trade restrictions were relaxed, but in a way that benefited Britain. This period saw the beginning of reforms, but exploitation continued under the guise of regulation. The third phase, from 1858 to 1947, was the period of direct crown rule. Here, finance capitalism dominated. India was systematically transformed into a dependent colony, supplying raw materials and consuming British finished goods. As the text explains, to quote, India moved from a colony to a dependent country and then on to an independent member of the Commonwealth, unquote. But before independence, this dependency ensured that India's economy was drained of resources while Britain grew richer. Thus, each phase of British policy, plunder, trade monopolies, and finance capitalism was united by one purpose: the economic exploitation of India and economic enrichment of Britain. This exploitation was deliberate. One of the most damaging aspects of British economic policy was the land revenue system. Agriculture was the backbone of Indian society, but under colonial rule, it turned into a machine for revenue extraction. The British introduced three systems: zamindari, rayatwari, and mahalwari. The zamindari system, introduced in Bengal in 1793 under the Permanent Settlement, that made zamindars responsible for collecting revenue. Taxes were fixed, but they had to be paid in full, whether crops failed or not. This created immense pressure on peasants who often lost their land. The Rayatwari system, introduced in large parts of South India, bypassed intermediaries. Peasants paid revenue directly to the government, but assessments were frequently revised upwards and the payment had to be made in cash. This forced farmers into debt. The Mehalwari system, used in northwestern India, held entire village responsible for the payment. When crops failed, entire communities were burdened. These systems disrupted indigenous traditional agrarian structures. Instead of shared responsibility and flexible arrangements, the British imposed rigid cash based demands. Peasants who defaulted faced land collection, land confiscation, and were turned into landless laborers. The first time in Indian history, entire communities of cultivators were uprooted from their land. Thus, land revenue policies were not just administrative reforms, they were deliberate tools of exploitation. They maximized income for the colonial state while destroying the economic security of the Indian farmers. Taxation under British rule was harsh and inhuman. In many cases, up to 50% of agricultural produce was taken as revenue. Unlike traditional systems, there was no adjustment in times of natural calamities like drought, flood, or famine. Peasants were expected to pay in full regardless of their ability. When cultivators defaulted, the punishments were cruel. Accounts described peasants being locked in cages, exposed to the blazing sun, or beaten until they surrendered their lands. Some families were so desperate that they even sold their children to meet revenue demands. This shows how taxation crossed the line from economic policy to violation of human dignity. The requirement to pay revenue in cash was another burden. In a subsistence economy, farmers traditionally paid in kind, but under British policies, they had to sell their products at a produce at a low price in markets controlled by traders and moneylenders, then use the cash to pay taxes. This made them further vulnerable to exploitation. The permanent settlement also ignored heritage rights. States were auctioned off to raise money, uprooting families who had cultivated the same land for generations. Peasants and landlords alike faced insecurity. In this way, taxation became a tool for economic plunder. It enriched the colonial treasury and fueled Britain's prosperity, but it left Indian villages impoverished and broken. Before the British, India was one of the world's largest producer of textiles. Its fabrics were known for their quality and artistry. Bengal's muslin, Gujarat's cottons, and Banarsi silk were exported worldwide. But under colonial rule, this flourishing industry was systematically destroyed. British policies imposed heavy import duties, sometimes as high as 70 to 80%, on Indian textiles entering Europe markets. At the same time, British textiles were allowed into India at very low tariff. This unfair trade policy made Indian cloth uncompetitive abroad and at home. There was also direct violence and coercion. Weavers faced harassment and looms were destroyed. Some accounts even mention weavers' thumbs being cut off so that they could not practice their craft. A powerful image of deliberate destruction. The results were catastrophic. India's share of world textile trade, once nearly a quarter, collapsed to almost nothing by the 19th century. Millions of artisans lost their livelihoods. Britain's Industrial Revolution, meanwhile, thrived on cheap raw cotton from India. Finished cloth from British factories flooded Indian markets, while Indian weavers starved. This was the first great case of deindustrialization in the modern world. A country that had once led global textile trade was reduced to a supplier of raw material. It was not a natural decline, but a deliberate policy of colonial exploitation. The collapse of traditional industries led to the destruction of India's artisan class. Cities that had once been vibrant centers of production and trade became ghost towns. Dhaka, which had been famous for its fine muslin, saw its population shrink dramatically as weavers lost their work and migrated elsewhere. Skilled craftsmen who had produced textiles, ceramics, metalwork, and jewelry for centuries suddenly found themselves without markets. Many were forced to abandon their crafts and take up agricultural labor, but agriculture was already overcrowded and under stress. So, They sank further into poverty. Women suffered deeply. Spinning and weaving had provided them with independent income, that too within the household, along with the household responsibilities. With the collapse of these industries, they lost both income and dignity. Families that had once been relatively prosperous were pushed into destitution. The destruction was not only economic but also cultural. Skills that had been passed down through generations were lost. Artistic traditions in textile, pottery, and metalwork declined. What had been a source of pride for Indian civilization was systematically dismantled. Urban centers like Murshidabad and Surat declined, while new colonial cities like Calcutta and Bombay grew, not as centers of Indian industry, but as hubs of British trade and administration. In short, the destruction of artisans was not just about jobs. It was about the breaking of a way of life. It was exploitation that left both economic and cultural wounds. Another dimension of economic exploitation was Britain's use of India for global trade, particularly through the cultivation of opium. Farmers in Bengal and other regions were forced to grow opium instead of food crops. This was not a choice, but a compulsion, as colonial officials pressured cultivators to accept advances and commit their land to opium protection. The opium was then exported to China, where it was exchanged for tea and other goods, and that Britain wanted. This trade became the foundation of Britain's profits in Asia. The consequences, however, were devastating. In China, widespread addiction led to social and political crisis, while in India, farmers starved because they could not grow enough food for themselves. This policy highlighted how colonial exploitation was not limited to India alone. India was made into a base for Britain's global ambitions. Farmers who resisted were punished, and once again, revenue demands ensured compliance. The British even fought the opium wars in China to protect this trade. Profits from Indian opium fueled the British economy, but the burden fell on Indian peasants. They suffered poverty and hunger while their land was used to serve the empire's international interests. Thus, the opium trade illustrates how India was exploited not only for Britain's domestic needs, but also for its global dominance. It shows how colonial exploitation was woven into a wider imperial network of profits. One of the clearest explanation of colonial exploitation came from Dadabhai Naoroji, a great nationalist thinker. He developed the famous drain theory, which showed how wealth was systematically taken out of India. According to his analysis, India exported goods worth millions of pounds to Britain every year, but received nothing in return. Profits, dividends, pensions, and salaries of British officials were all paid for by Indian revenues. Noroji estimated that around 30 million pounds were drained annually. This money was not reinvested in India. It went directly to Britain, fueling its prosperity. The impact was devastating. While Britain grew richer, India grew poorer. Noroji pointed out that even when Indians worked hard and produced goods, the fruits of their labor left the country. Half of India's revenues went abroad, leaving little for development, education, or welfare. This drain explained why poverty was increasing despite India's vast natural and human resources. It also revealed the structural nature of colonialism. Exploitation was not accidental but built on the systems. The drain theory became a powerful tool for Indian nationalism. It showed that independence was not only a political demand but also an economic necessity. Nauroji's work inspired leaders like Gokhale, Gandhi, etc., and it remains a classic critique of colonial economics. India was often described as Britain's cash cow, and for good reasons. The revenues collected from India financed not only the colonial administration but also Britain's global empire. Between 1765 and 1850, an estimated 18 million pounds were extracted annually. This money was used to fund wars in Europe, Africa, and Asia, none of which benefited India. Indian taxes also paid for pensions and salaries of British officials, many of whom retired comfortably in England. It was said that there were few kings in Europe richer than the directors of the East India Company. This captures the enormous profits made at India's expenses. Even public works in India, such as railways and canals, were financed through Indian revenues, but designed to benefit British trade. The profits from these projects went to British investors, while Indians bore the cost. This meant that Indians were literally paying for their own oppression. Their taxes supported the army that suppressed them, the officials who ruled them, and the empire that exploited them. By the end of the 19th century, the scale of this exploitation was obvious. India's resources had been converted into a financial backbone of Britain. The description of India as a cash cow perfectly symbolizes the one sided nature of colonial economics. Perhaps the most tragic consequence of economic exploitation was famine. Famines had occurred before, but under British rule they became more frequent and more deadly. The reason was simple: the colonial state prioritized revenue collection and exports over the survival of the people. During famines, food continued to be exported from India to Britain and other markets. Grain was shipped but out even while millions of Indians starved. Officials justified this saying by saying that they could not interfere with the free market. In reality, it was a deliberate policy of neglect. The Great Bengal Famine of 1770 killed nearly 10 million people. Later famines in the 19th century in Madras, Bombay, and the Deccan claimed over 20 million lives. In the late 19th century alone, India saw some of the deadliest famines in its history. Relief measures, when they existed, were minimal and slow. Instead of reducing taxes, the colonial state often demanded revenue even in famine years. Peasants sold land, livestock, and belongings just to survive. The right to food and survival was ignored. India, once a land of agricultural abundance, became associated with starvation and death. Famines were not natural disasters alone, they were man made tragedies created by policies that valued profit over human life. Colonial policies profoundly damaged Indian agricultures. Traditionally, farmers had autonomy to decide what crops to grow, balancing food grains with cash crop. But under British rule, this freedom disappeared. The state increasingly pushed peasants to cultivate indigo, cotton, jute, and opium, crops that served British industry and global trade, not Indian needs. This forced shift reduced food production. When more land was given to cash crops, there was less available for rice, wheat, and pulses. The result was chronic food insecurity. Famines became more common, as we saw earlier, because the agricultural system no longer prioritized feeding people. The introduction of monocultures also hurt the soil. Growing the same cash crop year after years led to depletion of fertility, reducing long term productivity, and farmers faced lower yields and higher risk. Debt was another serious problem. To pay heavy cash taxes, cultivators borrowed from moneylenders at very high interest rates. If crops failed or prices fell, they could not repay their loans. Many lost their land and were reduced to tenant farmers or laborers. By the 20th century, rural India was trapped in a cycle of poverty. Agriculture, which had once sustained India's prosperity, became a sector of insecurity and misery. This transformation was not natural. It was the direct result of policies designed to turn Indian farming into a tool for colonial profits while ignoring the needs of Indian society. The economic exploitation of India had deep social consequences. Poverty became widespread, unemployment increased, and inequality grew. Communities that had been self sufficient for centuries were broken apart. The destruction of industries pushed artisans into villages, overcrowding agriculture. This created competition for land and uh, lowered wages. Families that had once thrived on weaving or metalwork now struggled to survive as laborers. Women, in particular, lost independent sources of income. When spinning and weaving collapsed, they were forced into harsh agricultural labor or complete dependency. Health and nutrition suffered. Famines and poverty left millions malnourished. Epidemics like cholera and plague spread more easily among weakened population. With little investment in healthcare, people were left vulnerable. Education was neglected. Many families could not afford to send children to schools because every member was needed to work. Literacy rates remained low, especially among women. This limited opportunities for social mobility and reinforced cycles of poverty. Social inequality worsened. Rich landlords and moneylenders gained power because of the British systems, while peasants and artisans lost everything. Communities that had once been balanced in their structures became sharply divided between rich and poor. In short, colonial economic policies did not just exploit India's wealth, they reshaped society. They created a legacy of poverty, unemployment, illiteracy, and inequality that India had to struggle against even after. Economic exploitation was one of the strongest reasons for the uh, rise of Indian nationalism. Leaders quickly realized that political freedom was meaningless without economic freedom. Thinkers like Dadabhai Naoroji, R.C. Dutt, and M.G. Ranade exposed the reality of the drain of wealth and showed how Britain's prosperity was built on India's poverty. Naoroji's drain theory became a cornerstone of nationalist arguments, wherein he explained in detail how India's revenues were siphoned off to Britain, leaving nothing for local development. Gopal Krishna Gokhale added that poverty in villages was the direct result of colonial taxation and neglect. Mahatma Gandhi highlighted the exploitation of indigo farmers in Champaran and later the oppressive salt tax. By connecting economic grievances with the mass movement, he mobilized ordinary Indians against the empire. The Swadeshi movement, which encouraged Indians to boycott foreign goods and promote indigenous industries, was also a direct response to economic exploitation. Economic issues united people across regions and communities. Farmers, artisans, workers, and intellectuals all saw that colonial rule was draining India's lifeblood. Their shared suffering created a sense of collective identity and purpose. Thus, the struggle for independence was not just about ending foreign rule, it was about reclaiming India's economic dignity. Nationalism drew its strength from the people's demand for economic justice and the end of exploitation. The legacy of British economic exploitation was devastating and long lasting. By 1947, India's share of world GDP had shrunk from nearly a quarter in the 18th century to around 3%. A country once renowned for its prosperity and skilled industries had been reduced to poverty. The industrial base was destroyed. Traditional crafts and textiles never fully recovered. Agriculture remained stagnant, overburdened, and vulnerable to crisis. Millions of peasants were landless, trapped in cycles of debt and dependency. Poverty became a defining feature of Indian society. The social impacts were equally severe. Widespread illiteracy, malnutrition, and unemployment were products of centuries of neglect. Women and marginalized groups were particularly disadvantaged. Inequality, both economic and social, was entrenched. Even after independence, India struggled with these legacies. Building a self reliant economy required enormous efforts, from land reforms to industrialization. Uh, Policies had to be created to reverse the damage of centuries. At the same time, the experience of exploitation also shaped India's national identity. The demand for economic justice was central to the independence movement. And after 1947, leaders prioritized development, planning, and self sufficiency. In summary, the economic exploitation of India war under British rule left behind poverty, inequality, and stagnation, but it also fueled the determination to build a free and just nation. The scars of colonialism remain, but so does the resilience that grew out of resistance. Thank you.